but that's the beauty of the film board, is that you're allowed to experiment, and as Norman would always say, you're allowed to fail. And he sort of thought, frequently out of the failures came something new and exciting. And if something went wrong, he would say, well, if I want to do that, I know how to do it now. So it's that's the thing which attracts me to film making, is the idea of exploration and trying to learn about something I don't know anything about. In other words, I made a film about my life as a soldier, and so I was trying to understand the meaning of the actions I went through, you know, being a soldier. Why did I do that? What are the consequences, and so forth? And so instead of just sort of making a film forces you to focus on your question and to learn, that's you know, that's why I make films, because I think it's a fascinating journey into in Norman's case, it was into his subconscious. He would come in the morning and say, I had a dream last night, you know. Yeah. And
when I watch your films, I'm seeing also a very interesting way of creating. You have a poetic way of combining different elements, and editing is a big part of that as well. Just the expression of combinations and curatorial decision making from one moment to the next. So I was interested in knowing more about how your editing has changed over time, or how have you evolved in your editing?
Well, it's got slower because I'm antique, but the big influence on me, there were no film schools when I started making film. And my great teacher, initially, before I became a filmmaker, I was a school teacher, and was the films of Eisenstein. And the whole notion that you can take A and B and create a new thought, a new idea, which is C. And I thought it's dialectic. But as I've got older, my editing has sort of become not, you know, longer, as it were. In other words, my early films were very fast cutting, but now I allow ideas to develop more. And I think, but I'm still totally interested in the notion that of this whole business of juxtaposition of ideas, you know. I get amused looking at, I look at the BBC News website, and of course they have all these boxes and that. And the thing is that sometimes there's an image and there's a text, and there's an image and there's a text. And the thing is, I was looking at one yesterday and I thought it was interesting. The text which belonged to the previous image was quite interesting when you put it with the text of the image which was below it. And so I think that's one of the lovely things about editing is that the discovering of things you didn't expect, just by putting one image against another image. Or I mean, the other big influence on me was Glenn Gould, because Glenn Gould, some of you may know, he used to do radio documentaries, and he did, for instance, he did one on Richard Strauss, he did another one on Schoenberg, but he also did documentaries about Canada. He called it The Idea of North. And what he did was he had layers of sound, and so there would be some would say somebody talking and somebody else talking here, but it was completely different subject matter or connected, but the way he cut it was you heard everything. And he created this strange sound world. And I thought, how interesting to work with layers. And sometimes, now what does it mean when you make a film if you have this imagery, but you have a particular sort of soundtrack underneath it, which may contradict what you feel when you see the visual. You know, whereas most films, they use music to illustrate, as it were, to support what you're seeing. But what happens if you use sound and imagery in perhaps, shall we say, contradictory ways? So Glenn Gould's, if you ever get a chance, his radio documentaries are quite extraordinary. And anyway, and he cut them all himself. He used to have all this 1/4-inch tape, and he would just sit there cutting.
Is there any questions?
I'm smoking enough now.
Anybody? Yeah, please.
When can we see River Walk?
So I'm very lucky Yellen is here because those are the type of questions. Those are production questions.
Well, I mean, it did play just last month at the Festival du Nouveau Cinéma in the Nouveaux Alchimistes category. So that was the Montreal premiere. And it's hard to tell, but I guess it will take some time before because it's still in the festival circuit. So before it goes onto the NFB website, it will take a few months for sure. So, but I'll let you know as soon as we have a date.
And the wonderful thing was, it was at the Cannes Festival, and you know, which is an extraordinary thing. It's a great feather in one's cap.
It's a good surprise. Yeah.
Much more important than the Oscars, which are American.
So biased.
Absolutely.
Please.
Yeah, I guess like since it takes so long to make, I guess I'm wondering through like the creative process when you're trying all these different avenues, how do you know when to reel it in? How do you know, like how do you know when to reel it in when you're exploring so many possibilities?
I feel like that's applicable to, I guess, documentary as well. You know, just this kind of like lifeline and
Exhaustion.
Because you're basically.
Sometimes it's the producer,
Yeah.
but I think, would you agree it's a sort of a feeling that you had, like, you know, I can't go any further.
So for the last I would say since the beginning of time for animation, there's been this lovely thing which was scarcity in the mindset, right? So you basically have to get it done, and that kind of is like a ceiling. But essentially in the last year, there's so much abundance of image, this kind of genome of all these images kind of haunting you through the databases, that you're essentially back to where live action filmmaking is in documentaries, because there's so you have to have a curatorial eye on what not to show, which is much more common. It's a muscle that's probably more often developed in any documentary filmmaking and in live action in general. So I mean, it's not, I don't think we've even grasped how existentially, how big the shock is of how everything has changed about image making in the last year, because it's just changing the brain is completely doing a completely different thing. Because it usually never was, you had to get it done, and that itself was kind of almost like a blockchain. It's kind of, it limits your potential. So it was a very good place to be mentally, but now you're just completely, there's a leakage of potential in every direction. So it can really go crazy quickly. Maybe in the same way it has always been for somebody who's capturing a moment in real life. Yeah. But I was curious to also know, I mean, you often show, you kind of mentioned it already, but it was one of the questions, you often talk about how artists work, right? So it's the process. I was wondering what makes you interested in the process behind the art? Why is the process of the art so important to you?
Well, I just think that, I mean, the process is more interesting than the finished product.
I agree.
I mean, I'm not saying that with the audience. I think the audience is interested in the final thing, but I think, process of making is so interesting. I mean, some of you have probably read Jane Urquhart's novels, and I did a film once, and she figured quite large in the film. And this was her position, that somehow it was the act of creating, which was what drew her to write these novels, and that's where all the excitement is. And whereas, you know, we all know the page turners, that you know, we you know, they fit into templates, and we do tend to like them. But no, I think when it's just the act of making is exciting. We all go through this, you know. And the reason I got interested in the creative process, because I was an elementary school teacher, and I learned quite quickly that your job as a teacher, I was teaching 10 and 11-year-olds, was to give them the opportunity to become, you know, to explore, to grow, to expand. And to cut a very long story short, I used because I was a McLaren fan, and I'd never met him, the film board was giving me raw film stock, and one day a week they would work on their McLaren films. They would hand draw films, and eventually I showed them to McLaren in 1968. And the first thing he said to me was, "Wow, these are interesting. They're not copies of what I do." But the thing is that it was so exciting for me to see the children become free. In other words, they realized they didn't have to, because one of the problems with children is that at a certain age, when they're about 7 or 8, it becomes very important to them to be accurate in what they draw. You know, they want the house to look like a house, and they want the mother to look like their actual mother. But to actually to encourage them to let their subconscious come out and to play, because Norman used to say to me, the first law of cinema is play. And so I think that's where, I think it was in a classroom that I really first got interested in this whole process of creativity. Then I made a film about McLaren. I made 2 films about McLaren, and I made another one about the wonderful Evelyn Lambert, who was the first woman animator in Canada. And so that's where it all comes from. It comes from teaching children.
I personally really love that scene with the globe. That's one of my favorite scenes of all time. When there's the globe in the film, and the earth that's chopped into pieces.
Oh yeah,
I love
that's
that.
Evelyn Lambert, yeah.
It's a good one. But you know, it's just a little note. You know, we discussed animation filmmaking and just how in the last year, basically the process has been collapsed. That's what happened. You basically have this electric prompt that just collapses all human action into statistical probabilities, and it predicts what you ought to be doing instead of what you. So this whole, again, the process itself is fighting for air, and at the same time, a lot of people, going back to you're mentioning fun, I find it's quite an elegant irony that at the same time a lot of people are saying that it's gamifying our industry. So now people are just having fun testing different things on these softwares that are automating the profession. So at the same time, the fun is still there. So I'm just sharing that I'm really confused about where it's going, because the fun is there, the gamification of our medium is clearly there, since now thanks to these tools, more people can do it. So I'm just not really sure where I stand in this, but it's an interesting irony that both where there's more play, but also the process has been collapsed completely. I was going to ask a question more for the club, just so I can have a better idea. Do you usually watch films when you come here every week or every month, or do you?
It's once a month, and
Once a month?
we watch a documentary film. You've broken the mold here.
Of course, yeah, I've noticed.
No stress. But generally we invite the filmmaker if it's possible. We're so lucky that Don was able to come and present his film. So, and it really, we end up having quite lively discussions. I'll share one anecdote with you. We watched the Ninth Floor, Selin Selin's film about the computer center riots at Sir George Williams in 1968, I think it was. It's kind of a non-traditional documentary, but mostly it's talking heads, people from different parts of the space when the actual riot happened, and there's puts it in historical context. And in the audience that night, there were 4 people who had been there that night. One had been in the computer center, one had been in the street with the demonstration, and one had been trapped in a stairwell, so, that's the great value of sharing, documentary film with an audience that you can hear their experience, and then also, how they've interpreted the representation of their experience. So it's and people prefer to watch documentary films in a group as opposed to just at home. I mean, this we've been running this for almost 10 years. I think this is our 9th year.
Congratulations.
So I've seen like the popularity of having the opportunity to share the viewing experience, and it has a greater impact than when you're watching documentaries that promote social change or just information, historical events. It is a really rich experience, and we're very lucky that the Westmount Library has chosen to do this. And of course I want to thank the National Film Board, because the National Film Board used to, and Dawn can speak to this too, about the initial, they would send projectionists, the rural projectionists would go out with projectors and cans of film and go out to communities in the rural areas to share, so people would learn about different subjects, about what's going on in the country, learn what the original mandate of the NFB was to show Canada to Canadians from coast to coast to coast to coast. So the film board, evolved with the different technologies for distributing films, and eventually, when I joined the film board in the 80s, there were cinematics in all the cities, many cities, I think like even Moose Jaw, and like not just the major urban centers across the country, where people could go and borrow films, and then eventually video cassettes. Well, of course, those all got shut down at a certain point in 1996. Many of those kinds of services were closed. But how to share the films? We had a Mediatek in Montreal and one in Toronto. You could go and sit by yourself and with a touch screen, select a film, and have this cool.
And sorry, that's not the Cine Robotech.
The Cine, I'm talking about the Cine Robotech. That's what it was called in Montreal. It was the Mediatek in Toronto. But those closed also. So now we have the NFB.ca platform, so people can watch it from home on their own, and it's a different experience than going to borrow a 16mm film and showing it at your kid's birthday party, which is something I did, of course, or in a community center or groups. So the fact that the film board is now making this NFB program in libraries, it's a specific program. There's a dedicated team. They produce programming guides and suggestions for different moments in the year that you might want to show, about women in March, because it's Women's History Month, so that's why we invited John at that moment, because also his film was available at that. So I just want to highlight the great work of the film board, just to answer your question long-windedly about what this club is.